record on. Well, that seems like a new feature. Cool. Awesome. Well, welcome to the Study Tips Workshop with Emel Tabaku. I'm Adam Gorley, the outreach coordinator for the OCAD SU, and I'm just going to pass it right over to Emel. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Adam. I'm going to share my screen with you. Here we are. So thank you for coming to this workshop on strengthening your reading and note-taking skills for more effective studying. Just before I get onto it, I want to acknowledge the land that we're meeting on is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So with that said, my name is Emel. I've just completed my 4th year at OCAD University. At OCAD, I major in drawing and painting, and I minor in art history. Actually, since the start of the pandemic, I decided to kind of start and complete a minor. So I ended up taking 7 art history courses this past year. And it's been a very interesting experience. And I think this is where my love for research, reading, and note-taking flourished more so than in prior years. The purpose of this workshop is to identify the most effective reading and note-taking strategies in order to help students understand the material that they're dealing with. Some of the texts that I'm just going to put this down. Some of the texts that we will deal with tend to be very complex, and they tend to be very dense as well. They're written by scholars, by authors, by researchers, and the main targeted audience tends to be similar scholars and researchers and authors in the same field. So when I say that this will take hours, the workshop will not be taking hours, but the whole process of reading and note-taking and understanding a text written by a scholar tends to be time-consuming and tends to be difficult as well. I personally feel overwhelmed sometimes even after simply having read the title of the paper or the title of the book. But do not give up. Reading a paper doesn't have to be boring. It can actually be a very fun experience as well. And as with any practice in life, whether it be your painting practice, personal practice, or anything in life, music, the more you read, then the more you start taking notes, and the more notes you take, the better you get at it. The more effective and less time you will be spending to understand the text. So as I mentioned, academic texts are dense. So how do we digest them? Especially if you're a non-native English speaker, if English is not your first language, and if you're an international student, or even if English is your first language, you might still face some difficulty understanding academic texts because of the language that's being used. It's not as accessible, it tends to be very complex rather, and with a lot of jargon terms in it. However, I've identified and I want to share with you sort of the guide that I've used this past year, especially to help me with my art history and visual culture courses. And we all know that in order to be graduating OCAD University, you need art history and visual culture credits. And even though probably you don't want to take them, but still developing and kind of perfecting your reading and note-taking strategies will be an essential skill for any career you choose in life. So with that said, here are some of the ways for you to grasp where the author is coming from and what the main academic arguments are. So first, you can find some alternative writings that share common themes to the work that you're trying to read. So the first thing that I do, if the professor, for example, has assigned an academic paper for me to read, I basically identify the category that this paper has been posted under, whether it be postmodernism or postcolonial studies. And I try to think if I've done similar readings in the past, and I try to look through my notes. I saved my notes from prior courses, past courses. So I try to look through my notes to see if it's an area that I'm familiar with, and I try to pull those notes out, and I review them on a regular basis in order to build some common reading experience to the work that I'll be dealing with next. And you can also find alternative writings in new places and spaces, such as text reviews, art criticism texts, magazines, online interviews, museum websites are also very useful. For my art history courses, if I was doing research or I was trying to read up on an artist from, let's say, the 60s or the 80s, I would go go to a museum and see the programming and the exhibition that they had in the past years, or if they're currently running an exhibition on a solo exhibition on the artist's work. And what museum websites usually do is they post a very short, brief bio to kind of contextualize the work the work of the artist as the work of the author, and also provide relevant and related texts or other artists that you may explore. So the second thing that I do after being assigned an academic paper to read is I research a bit about the author. And this is sort of common sense. You want to know who the author is that you'll be reading up on. Like the second text that we will be working with is Gayatri Spivak. So what do you know about Gayatri Spivak's work? What do you know about her? I know that she's an Indian theorist. She primarily deals with post-colonialism, as well as Marxism and studies as well. And she also deals with women's and gender studies. That's basically the focus of her writings. So knowing a bit about the author, knowing the date that the material was also written in, will help you contextualize the piece better, and it will help you understand more so, and will give you, knowing a bit about the socioeconomic or the political conditions that the writing was written, that the author wrote the piece during the time period that the author wrote the article at, or the book, will also help you understand what the theoretical foundation to the idea is, basically. So you may come across forums, student presentations, more critics, and more reviews. I will share with you one of the text reviews I was able to locate on JSTOR, which is a fantastic tool if you're doing research, or if you're trying to find anything relevant to your studies, to your personal, whether it be thesis or courses. And that text is a review on the author, on the critic we will be dealing with next, Theodor Adorno. So reading someone else's review on the author that you need to be studying will help you, you'll basically gain a different perspective. The writing tends to be a bit more simplified as well, and it explains what the author that you need to be studying actually does, what their main arguments are, where they're coming from, what standpoints they take. Sorry. So the third thing that I usually do when I'm dealing with an academic paper is I implement the 3-step reading approach. I've kind of titled it as a 3 S's, 3 steps, and I'll be sharing this with you on our next slide. But I just want to emphasize that, again, that academic papers, academic reading and research does not have to be boring. You can get creative with it. What I usually do is I have a lot of albums on research visuals and research information. You can try to come up with collages and mood board of the collected material, and have fun with it. If I just show you now, I'm doing research right now. I can show you now, but I do have so many tabs open for JSTOR, and yeah, go down the research rabbit hole, and always take time to recharge. I think one of the best ways for you to retain information is if you give your reading experiences some space in between. And this is what I'll also talk about in my 3-step reading approach. So minimize this, there you go, that's helpful. So the 3-step reading approach, we have 3 S's. The first one is to scan. This is a photo of my notebook. And what do I mean by scanning? Well, skim the research paper, skim the article. This means that you just tackle the title, read the title first, read the subheadings of the paragraphs. Just read, go over the abstract intro. It doesn't have to be an intense reading of it, but just so you can get a rough idea of what the author is discussing. Also, try to point some of the keywords that come up. Maybe you're familiar with some of the words, maybe you're not. Maybe you want to come up with a list of words that pop up that you want to be Googling later, if you're not familiar with them. So I suggest that the scanning process should take 15 to 20 minutes. Depending on the length of the article, of course, I would give you 5 minutes to scan the text that we will be dealing with. Theodore Adorno's text on commitment is 2 pages long. So 5 minutes is a reasonable time for this. And as well as Gayatri Spivak's text is 5 pages long. So also 10 to 15 minutes is an ideal time to be scanning a 5-page article. So what is the second step? The second step is to start. And what do I mean by start? Is giving yourself a chance to actually read the article from start to finish. And while you do this process, make sure that you're taking down some notes. You jot down some questions, you're highlighting key ideas. The maximum time you should be spending on a first pass reading is 1 to 2 hours. Sometimes it even takes longer. As I mentioned, it really depends on the length of the article that you're dealing with. And yes, and the third step is to study. And what do I mean by study? So this is where you're having a second passing at the article. And what I need you to do is, it would be best for you to be critical at this point. Really read the material with a critical lens and try to understand each sentence. And because by understanding each sentence that you're dealing with, you're really learning. Sometimes I read research papers maybe thrice, and I still walk away without knowing the whole story. So maybe you need more than 2 reads. Maybe you need 3. Maybe you need 3 times to tackle the paper. So it really depends. Everyone has a very unique reading experience, and what I'm saying is definitely does not apply to everyone. But the more you read and the more notes you take, you'll definitely develop your own unique style. So, oops, sorry. So how to know if you've understood the material that you've read? How do you know if you're retaining the information? Ask yourself these questions. The first one being, what is the name of the author, the title of the paper, the year it was published? This is key information that you should already know at the top of your head after you've completed the reading. The second question, what is the key argument? Many people say, what is the thesis of the paper? What is the author trying to say? What is the whole article about? Can you sum this up in only one single sentence? What are the main ideas of the text? What are the theories that were being introduced? Did the author reference any other critics, any other theorists in the piece? Is the author mentioning more than one theme? Are some of the themes overlapping? So what are the main ideas? Next question, what key concepts or terms did I encounter that I did not know of before? So as I said in the beginning of the reading process, you can do a scan. You can look for keywords or key phrases that you're not familiar with, and at whatever time throughout the reading process, you can Google the meaning of these words. So what key concepts or terms are you not familiar with that you've been able to identify and you've been able to bring solutions to those problems? Next question, how can the author's ideas be applied in other areas of research? So let's say you're reading a paper that is on postmodernism. How can what the author introduced in this article, how can you bring this in to another research field, combining with feminist theories, for example? What did I think of the piece? The most important thing for after you've read the article is for you to have already created an opinion. So do you agree with the author? Do you agree with what the author is proposing? Do you have a different opinion? What do you think of the writing? These are very important questions that will definitely help you summarize the content that you've read. And you'll be able to understand if you yourself know this. You can also try to share the material that you've read and teach it to someone else. After you've done a second or third reading of the article, you should feel confident enough to share what you've read with a friend, and you should feel confident enough to write about it. And this is where I think that summarizing the article right at the end of reading it, or maybe a few days after, it will definitely help you retain the information, the material, as well as it's a different way for you to test yourself out. Have you actually understood? Do you need to do more reading? Do you need to do additional reading on other authors' works on similar themes? These are very important questions. that once identified and once you're able to answer them, of course, they will make the whole reading and learning experience and transition into the academia world more smooth for you. So now let's start. We will start with going through the first text. I've selected Theodore Adorno's text on commitment. It's from the Art and Theory book, published in 1962. It is only 2 pages long, and I have a PDF of it that without the notes and without highlighted sentences. Well, whereas the second version of it has all the details. So I'll be demonstrating sort of the reading and the note-taking strategies that I take that I have enforced over this past year. Yeah, and let's get started. Okay. 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 So this is the text. I will give you 5 minutes to go over it. And there you go, up to here. And then I will be taking this one by one with you and to sort of share my own note-taking and reading strategies that you can apply as well. So let's start with the first paragraph. Theodore Adorno from Commitment. After the Second World War, members of the Frankfurt School who had been exiled in the USA during the Nazi years returned to West Germany and reestablished the Institute for Social Research. So already here I'm getting an idea of post-war experiences. So that's what's going in mind right now. Adorno became its director after Horkheimer's retirement in 1959. Adorno remained hostile to overtly political art, a position which he had initially set out in dialogue with Walter Benjamin in the 1930s. So I already feel that this is a key point in this paragraph, and that's why it's highlighted. It is already giving the audience the idea, the main idea that and stance that Adorno takes. It's saying that he is against overtly political art, a position which he had set out in dialogue with Walter Benjamin in the 30s. So now I start thinking about who is Walter Benjamin. What I would do at this time is, is go on Google and search up Walter Benjamin and see if there's something that you find to kind of help you understand who Walter Benjamin is and what his theories are and how his theories relate to Theodore Adorno. So for example, here we have that Walter Benjamin in the 1930s, exactly the time in the article, mentioned Benjamin's efforts to develop a politically oriented materialist aesthetic theory proved an important stimulus for both the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory and the Marxist poet and dramatist Bertolt Brecht. So this Benjamin's efforts to develop a politically oriented materialist aesthetic theory, it's sitting in dialogue with Adorno, and Adorno's stance on political art. This debate was given renewed currency after the war by Sartre's essay, What is Literature?, which had called for a committed art. This is where I ask myself, what is Sartre about? What is Sartre's political ideological stance? In the present text, Adorno reaffirms his belief in the critical power of autonomous art. Okay. This is another key point that must be highlighted. It's a very clear sentence, segment of the sentence. Adorno reaffirms his belief in the critical power of autonomous art. So we already have a discussion between autonomous and committed art going on right now. A position which in the later 60s was to bring him into conflict with a new generation of radical student activists. Adorno's is not, however, a claim for for l'art pour l'art, which is art for art's sake. So art for art's sake, you can, if it's a concept that you're not familiar with at first, you can quickly go, sorry. And see and identify the concept. Art for art's sake, it's a French slogan from the early 19th century expression that philosophy that intrinsic value of art and only true art is divorced from any didactic, moral, political, utilitarian function. Okay. So you can make notes of new concepts and new keywords that you're encountering throughout the reading. And just put them on the side, and you can come back to them later to kind of summarize the whole piece and really merge all the new material together with the writing. Okay. Adorno had earlier claimed that to write poetry after Auschwitz would be barbaric. So art made in response, this is a note that I made in response to this claim. Art made in response to a horrific event would be as horrific, if not more. Is this what the author is trying to say? That this is why art needs, this is why a committed art must be prohibited. Without abandoning this claim, he now reread it not as a total prohibition on art, but as a prohibition on committed art. So this is where I try to make to differentiate between what is the difference between simply art and committed art. Does committed art come with a political focus, or is committed art, or does it not? Okay. For its very commitment required, as he put it in Entente, underline any words you're not familiar with. What is the meaning of this word? Maybe you can come back to it later. With the world which was to be affected. The paradoxical result was that only the autonomous work of art could be the site of resistance to the competing interest of a debased reality. Okay, so we go into the actual piece. This was just the intro that we were provided with in Art and Theory textbook. This is the problem of suffering. The segment here is Theodore Adorno's. So this is a primary source. I have no wish to soften the saying that to write lyric poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. It expresses negative form, the impulse which inspires committed literature. The question asked by a character in Sartre's play, Mort sans sepulture. So this is something else that you maybe are not familiar with. You don't necessarily have to, Google all of the new things, new concepts, new ideas that are coming up in the text, but it's still interesting to keep note of the fact that Adorno is relating back to Sartre, apart from Walter Benjamin. Is there any meaning in life when men exist who beat people until the bones break in their bones? Is also the question whether any art now has a right to exist, whether intellectual regression is not inherent in the concept of committed literature because of the regression of society. This is highlighted for a very good reason. It also reinforces the thesis. And yes, so I've made a note right here, but on some Berg's retort also remains true that literature must resist this verdict. Who is Anselm Berg, and what are his claims? What is his theory? It is now virtually in art alone that suffering can still find its voice. This is another point that if you've read this piece, you should have also highlighted. Consolation without immediately being betrayed by it. The most important artists of the age have realized this. The uncompromising radicalism of their works, the very features defamed as formalism, gave them a terrifying power, absent from helpless poems to the victims of our time. So this is where I made a note. Oh, is the author saying that formalism, abstraction, and non-linear self-expression are more powerful for societal shifts and responses than works that are very literal, than works who bring up the trauma and pain in very literal ways, who bring up images of war? So this is an important question to ask as well. And just make notes of all the questions that you have while reading this text, and at the end, after you've done a second or a third read of this, you'll be able to answer those questions yourself. Here I made another note, reference to look up, Schnomberger survivor foresaw. There we go. A few words that I've underlined. Words that are not, I don't use in my daily vocabulary, so I'm unfamiliar with them. So it's also important for you to look those words up. Maybe not now, but maybe later. It is rather the way in which by turning suffering into images, despite all their hard implicability, they won't are shamed before the victims. For these are used to create something, works of art that are thrown to the conception of a world which destroyed them. The so-called artistic representation of the sheer physical pain of people beaten to the ground by rifle butts contain, however remotely, the power to elicit enjoyment out of it. This is a very important point. Clearly, Adorno is saying that images of that translate suffering, that translate pain, that are not abstract, but they're committed to a tragedy and to politics, they tend to be thrown back into this idea of the consumption of the world. They're just being consumed. They're being digested by the by higher authorities. And it even, these works can even make people enjoy them, enjoy the visuals of war and of pain and of tragedy. So this is the problem that Adorno emphasizes, and that's why I've decided to highlight this point, these sentences as well. The moral of this art, not to forget for a single instant, slithers into the abyss of its opposite. The aesthetic principle of stylization, even the solemn prayer of the chorus, makes an unthinkable fate appear to have had something. It is transfigured. Something of its horrors removed. This alone does an injustice to the victims. All of these words that you might just note down, they're very important, especially if you're doing a summary. They will remind you of what was being discussed, for example. They're very keywords, especially, and they're all kind of at the end of either a sentence or before a comma. And this was another very important point that I hope you also highlighted when you read this text. When genocide becomes part of the cultural heritage and the themes of committed literature, it becomes easier to continue to play along with the culture which gave birth to murder. Okay. Sometimes this develops into dismal metaphysic, which does its best to work up atrocities into limiting situations. I should have highlighted this. This is also very important. Which it then accepts to the extent that they reveal authenticity in man. In such a homely existential atmosphere, the distinction between executioners and victims becomes blurred. Both, after all, are equally suspended above the possibility of nothingness. And this is where I had a question. What does equally suspended above the possibility of nothingness mean? No justice is being served for victims as memory is repressed via the justification or end result of literature with focus on humanity and its limiting situations. As executioners are taken out of the dialogue of war, is that what the author says, what follows up saying, which of course is generally not quite so uncomfortable for the executioners. Very, very interesting. So this you can definitely have a third read at this, and once you do so, you'll be able to understand the context much better. Overall, and tackle some of the words that you had underlined. I can't really locate them now, but go and find the meaning of those words. Aporia. What is aporia? Implicability. Try to find an acronym that will make it easier for you to understand the word itself. So what is Adorno saying in this piece? Well, Adorno is saying that any kind of art, really, after Auschwitz, that is representing any events from Auschwitz, is kind of an act of, is a barbaric, is a betrayal, and it's at the same degree as barbaric as what the Nazis did. And so this is why he's putting forth this other idea of art that is willing to criticize what's around it and is able to do that and successfully. And this is where he brings up the idea that art needs to be independent, not committed. where we have it right here, a prohibition. Mm, Not as a total prohibition on art, but as a prohibition on committed art. So Adorno does not support committed art. Instead, he promotes this idea of an independent art. Um, in other words, it feels like making references to Auschwitz or making suffering the subject matter of an artwork or an art piece, in making a reference and subject matter to a catastrophic event, any catastrophic event really, like Auschwitz, and making visuals around this is kind of, in other words, being complicit in the event as well. That's the that it seems that Adorno is suggesting that. Are you maybe you're being complicit in the suffering, in making that into some kind of intellectual enjoyment? This is where he says whether any art now has a right to exist, whether intellectual regression is not inherent in the concept of committed literature because of the regression of society. So making it the art just for the sake of art for art's sake, turning it into an intellectual debate, really getting rid of its humanity, and basically these are ideas that Adorno is putting forth. Um, so in other words, if we look at this sentence, when genocide becomes part of the cultural heritage and themes of committed literature, it becomes easier to continue to play along with the culture which gave birth to murder. So I feel like in this sentence, Adorno is suggesting that any type of art that is persuading you to have a clear understanding or an entry into, or a kind of deluding you into thinking that that history does not come with the genocide. It's kind of obscuring genocide, and it's instead occupying it with kind of a moral high ground, um, is uh, is not part of an autonomous art, and it does not identify as autonomous art. It falls under committed art, which is actually problematic. He's suggesting that it's problematic because of um, the intellectual debate that people are enforcing in it. So Adorno is suggesting that a work of art would have an absolute, would have absolute resistance and more of a voice, if it was not connected, to such traumatic events in such literal ways, and if it wasn't highly intellectualized, and made accessible and made more accessible. Um, these are some of the points that I'm thinking of when reading this text. Um, I would also love to hear your ideas. Mhm. And yes, I want to give you some time to go read this text again. Um, take um, um, take consideration of what I've kind of thrown at you, and let's see if we can come back with a different idea, for different view of this reading. I'm gonna stop sharing for now, and I will give you a 5-minute break, and then we will come back for the second text on Gayatri Spivak, who claims alterity.
Hey, Emil, would you like to pause for 5 minutes?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, it's totally up to you. How are you feeling?
Yeah, because I wasn't, I was kind of winging it, even though I wanted participation. It was a bit um, difficult to find the right words to run it without any participation.
No problem.
So yeah, I just give me, yeah, I would definitely need 5 minutes to kind of Yeah, prepare for the second one. The second one is much longer. It's 5 pages long, so I don't want to be reading 5 pages, and I expected people to kind of read and then to join in. So I'm thinking of ways to kind of make it easier. It's not as engaging as I hoped, definitely.
Sure, yeah, no problem. Yeah, we'll give you 5 minutes for sure. I'll pause the recording. Cool.
So thanks for coming back. We're going to be doing Gayatri Spivak's. We're going to be analyzing Who Claims Authority. It's another short text in the Art and Theory textbook. It's a bit longer than Theodore Adorno's. Of course, that was 2 pages. This one that we will be reading together is 5 pages long. So let me bring it out. Here we are. And so I asked you to also do a scan of this article. So when you're looking at this, what are some of the things that you should be spotting for? The title, Gayatri Spivak, Who Claims Authority. We note that we already have a similar introduction and very brief, similar to the other text right here that gives us context as to Spivak's work. What her theories primarily deal with. Then we go through the reading and we can identify key words like post-colonial, alternative history, to kind of make a sense of what this reading will be all about. Historical narratives, Indian decolonization, all the tools for developing alternative histories, gender, race, ethnicity, class. So this is an example of how you'd be scanning an article. Marx. So you already know that the author will be introducing some Marxist theories in it. Of course, political economy, political economism, production of value. Things like this that you can make a note of as well. Disenfranchised female in decolonized space. That seems very important. Some of the keywords that you come across will kind of feel like they're summarizing all of the text. Some are actually very, very good. The fourth person is diasporic post-colonial. Oops. There you go. So we would be highlighting that as well. So we don't have any subheadings in this piece because it's only 5 pages long. The author does not need to do any subheadings. It's not a lengthy article, but definitely identifying some of the key words, going with the title, reading the intro. Let's do that now. Reading the intro and the abstract will definitely help you understand the work, and it will kind of ease you into the text itself. So Indian by birth, the author is professor of literature at University of Pittsburgh. Since then, she has been particularly concerned with issues of gender and ethnicity. This we definitely highlight because it tells us what the writing may be on, and has become established as a leading contributor to one form of intellectual conjecture identified with postmodernism. We definitely highlight this as well, and we start asking ourselves, have we done any readings on postmodernism before? Do we know a bit about postmodern theory? Can we say anything about it? I can say that postmodernism has two components. It refers to something that should have happened after modernity. It has kind of a temporal meaning, and it also is a concept and a content. Postmodernism from my knowledge of it, it's you producing something different and new that disrupts the meta narrative of enlightenment, meta narratives of colonialism, nationalism, culturalism. So we already get an idea of what this piece may be on if the author's specialty is on postmodernism, is on issues of gender and ethnicity. The present text has its origins in Symposium on Remaking History. Okay, remaking history, what do you think of? For example, you can make a note of remaking history. See if we can add a text. For example, this may bring up any thoughts on how history is narrated, who is in charge of creating history, and how can we reclaim historical narratives? Maybe these are some of the thoughts that you may be thinking of that you think this text will address. The present text's origins, symposium on remaking history, the specific project of which was to challenge the supposedly Eurocentric and masculine orthodoxy of history writing. That's very important as well, and also ties into the purpose of postmodernism and what the author may be discussing in her piece. Unlike many who share this supposition, Spivak retains an investment in the Marxist tradition. This is another key thing that we must be highlighting. If you're not familiar with Marxist theories, then this is why you'd make a note of it on the side to kind of get yourself more familiar with it. For her, though, class is relatively abstract matter when compared to other lived conditions such as race or gender. It is nevertheless a determination which is ignored at the peril by those who write in the name of alternatives. So this intro is slash kind of very short abstract. It also gives us what the author is trying to achieve through this writing on who claims alterity. Her own particular focus with class analysis is not with the sphere of the economic per se, but with the operation of power and with its effects and culture upon those marginalized by its operation. So I made a note of it here. These are just some of the thoughts you may be experiencing that you want to put on the side of your reading. It says privileged writing in name of alternatives, scholars with no lived experiences to issues of class, race, and gender and class. As an abstract matter, does the author mean that it's an intellectualized field? It is excluding real alternatives of history. It's too abstract and too scholarly and thus inaccessible to marginalized communities. What is the author trying to say through here? In the present text, she maintains skepticism towards claims for alternative status made within the framework of what she dubs transnational postmodernity. Highlighted this as well. In her view, certain forms of demagogy. So words you're not familiar with, definitely underline them and tackle them later. Find their meanings later, if not now. If you want to get through the intro without being interrupted, then you do that and you go back, find the meanings of those words, make a note of that, and you'll get a better idea of what the sentence meant later when you do a second or third read of it. Okay. So this was the intro. Well, we can start with the reading itself. I will sort of explain why I highlighted these and why I find them important and how they will help me understand the text better. So as a post-colonial, this seems like the author is already identifying her work with post-colonial theories. I'm concerned with the appropriation of alternative history or histories. This is very, very clear statement. That's why I highlighted it. It's already right off the bat, it's telling us what the author is concerned with. I am not a historian by training. I cannot claim disciplinary expertise in remaking history in the sense of rewriting it, but I can be used as an example of how historical narratives are negotiated. Is this what the text will be about? It is important to highlight this as well, because it kind of gives us an idea of what the author is trying to do in the writing as well. How historical narratives are negotiated. Through what strategies will she be identifying later on? Maybe she will make a reference to Marxism, and to gender studies, and to class. The parents of my parents' grandparents were made over, not always without their consent, by the political, fiscal, and educational intervention of British imperialism. And now I am independent. So this is where I made a note of it. After reading the sentence, you might be, again, It might inspire you to think, to have your own thoughts regarding the topic. I wrote, one has more space nowadays to reclaim narratives, to rewrite histories, and to disrupt traditional histories more so than other people before in previous generations, past generations, created by colonizers, and with this, the Western practice of history. So I'm thinking that the purpose as to why Spivak might be wanting to negotiate historical narratives is perhaps because they derive from this Western practice of history making. So yes, this is important. Thus, I am in the strictest sense a post-colonial. This whole paragraph, what it's actually doing is also giving you a definition of what Spivak thinks post-colonialism is. So that's also important to make a note of. I should have highlighted this as well. Okay. Let me then speak to you as a citizen of independent India and raise the necessary critical and cautionary voice about false claims to alternate histories. Okay, here I'm thinking that even something like alternate histories, multiple narratives, multiple histories, I'm thinking that, oh, the author is saying that there could be false claims tied into this, so they're not as truthful as their intention may be. So this is something to also make a comment on the side. Perhaps this is something that you've thought of as well. False claims and false promises are not euphoric topics. Another word that you want to highlight, if you're not familiar with, then you can come back and find the meaning and put it in the context of the sentence later. I'm also a feminist who's an old-fashioned Marxist, and some of that will enter into this discussion of the cultural politics of alternative historiographies. Sorry. So here I've noted down that the background that Spivak is providing us with a background and the context to her ideologies. She's saying that they derive from Marxism, and she will be discussing the cultural politics. So this is where you ask yourself, are you familiar with other research fields, with other themes? Are you familiar with Marxist theories? If not, this would be a good time, if you're doing your second reading or your third reading of the piece, to go and find something, to go and find more information about it. How are historical narratives put together? We produce historical narratives and historical explanations by transforming the socius upon which our production is written into more or less continuous and controllable bits that are readable. Because the author has made this writing in italics, it's keep note of things like this. It's telling us that the author is emphasizing this concept. Our production is written in controllable bits that are readable. How these readings emerge and which ones get sanctioned have political implications on every possible level. So what is the sentence saying? How these readings emerge and which ones are sanctions? Is it telling us that there is such thing as selected history narratives? That's why we need space for alternate histories, multiple narratives. So you make note of things like this as well, kind of deriving conclusions from readers' suggested sentences and ideas. The master words implicated in Indian decolonization offered four great legitimizing codes consolidated by the national bourgeoisie by way of the culture of imperialism: nationalism, internationalism, secularism, culturalism. I already spoke about it in a few minutes ago, a bit earlier, that all of these fall under our ideas that postmodernism is trying to disrupt, our narratives that postmodernism is trying to reject. Modernist claims that postmodernism aims to reject. So if the privileged subject operated by these codes as a subject of an alternative history, we must meditate upon how we are written rather than simply read their mask as historical exposition. So I highlighted the word meditate because it really gets me thinking of a few things. I made a note that A critical stance on histories that are being proposed as alternative under culturalism, secularism, and internationalism, more closely so in the context of India and India's independence. What does it mean to remove the mask, to reveal the truth, and to meditate? To meditate on histories and on meanings. So that's what this paragraph kind of got me thinking about. Full of the tools for developing alternative histories, gender, race, ethnicity, class. Class is surely the most abstract. Definitely very short, beautiful sentence that you can highlight. And whenever you go back to this writing, it kind of gives you right off the bat what Spivak thinks about class in comparison to gender and race issues. She clearly considers that as the most abstract. Okay. And here, the next page actually focuses on Marxism, the author is trying to include Marxist theories into her work on post-colonial theories as well. So in the language that I've been using, one might summarize Marx as saying that the logic of capitalism weaves the socius like the textile of a particular set of relationships. Okay. Reading the archives of capitalism, Marx produces a critique not of cultural but of economic politics. And the other reason why I probably jumped from here to here, and let's say this is my first read, I'm doing a scan, or this is my second reading of it, is because I noticed again that the author had a word in italics. And yes, this is very, very key. Sentence, reading the archives of capitalism, Marx produces a critique, not of cultural, but of economic policies. In the current global post-colonial context, our model must be a critique of political culture, political culturalism, whose vehicle is the writing of readable histories, mainstream or alternative. That is a very good point as well. You can always come back and refer to this, especially if you're summarizing the text. So just by reading this much so far, what do we think that Spivak is trying to say? What are her thoughts on discourses of post-colonialism and alterity? How do we understand postmodernism through what Spivak is suggesting through lenses of post-colonial, through lenses of capitalism, economic politics? So, yeah. I'm going to highlight this as well. This is where she brings in gender issues into the dialogue. It seems obvious to some of us that the disenfranchised female in decolonized space being doubly displaced by it is the proper carrier for critique of pure class analysis. Separated from the mainstream of feminism, this figure, the figure of the gender subaltern, is singular and alone. So what is being suggested? Really, Spivak, by including Marxist and post-colonial studies, it seems that she's taking a different approach. She's introducing a different point of view compared to other postmodernist theories who tend to be more essentialist. And she's saying that there is a possibility in postmodern, in postmodernism, not only to reject the grand narrative, meta-narrative, whether it be of enlightenment and culturalism, nationalism, but to understand why you're doing it, and by understanding where you are as a subject located to this narrative. So that's very important as well. kind of coming up or rather identifying an in-betweenness and your own subject position to be able to critique the narrative of modernism as Eurocentric and male-centric, as Spivak suggested. Um, and this is very important as well. I would highlight the whole paragraph. The diasporic post-colonial can take advantage, most often unknowingly, I hasten to add, of the tendency to conflate the two in the metropolis. Thus, this frequently innocent informant, identified and welcome as the agent of an alternative history, may indeed be the site of chiasmus, thus crossing of a double contradiction, the system of production of the national bourgeoisie at home and abroad, the tendency to represent neo-colonialism by the semiotic of internal colonization. So I guess with Spivak, I'm going to write a note of it as well, is maybe the author is the author um, dissecting history written from the position of power, um, that was not shared, um, preventing alternative for the making of alternative histories. Mm. Again, we encounter very similar keywords here that might be highlighted as well, and these words have been repeated throughout the text. Um, what I also find very helpful is actually going right at the conclusion and trying to make out the point of the article there as well, and see if you can make some connections to the intro and to the first few paragraphs. So we can start reading that bit. I actually want to start right from here, where the author clearly states that she proposes an idea, she proposes a different approach. Therefore, I propose the persistent establishment and reestablishment, the repeated consolidating and undoing of a strategy of education and classroom pedagogy, attending to provisional resolutions of oppositions as between secular and non-secular, national, subaltern, national and international, cultural and socio-political, by teasing out their complicity. So with sentences like these that are very, very lengthy, what you would like to do is highlight the whole thing, maybe take this, put it in a blank space, put it, transfer it over to your notes. Sometimes with sentences that you find in the text, you may not be able to understand them because they're so loaded, because the texts tend to come across as more confusing and more complex. So it would be a good strategy for you to actually pull this out and put it on a blank piece of paper. or another blank document. And with sentences that are lengthy, what we can do is kind of divide them in two to better understand in two shorter sentences. Of course, it is one idea you can, it would be hard to connect, to disconnect, but try to remain within the same idea that the author has for in the sentence structure. So I propose the persistent establishment and reestablishment, the repeated consolidating and undoing of a strategy of education and classroom pedagogy. So we already know that it seems like Spivak is proposing this idea of education and as one of the tools for understanding, as one of the decolonial tools that you can use to understand, to better understand histories and to better understand your own position in history and your own position in location to a narrative. So that's important. Such a strategy or strategy of strategies must speak from within the emancipatory master narratives, even while taking a distance from them. The historical. My contractual situation as a post-colonial is in a place where I see claims to the subjectship of alternative histories coming. Here again, that idea of the classroom education comes through in another acronym, a literary pedagogy. Choosing text carefully can at least prepare another space that makes visible the fault lines and slogans of the European Enlightenment. Basically, it brings to light the problems of nationalism, internationalism, secularism, culturalism. It brings not only to light, but it starts critiquing these narratives as well. And that is what Spivak seems to propose. This, strictly speaking, is deconstructive pedagogy. Here she goes further to explain kind of the style of this education that she proposes. Like all good teaching in the humanities, it is hopeful and interminable. It presupposes and looks forward to a future interior of achieved solidarity and thus nurses the present. Very interesting. Maybe you can highlight this and maybe ask yourself, if nursing the present, is this via focus of the future? Does it take into consideration? Is it taking into consideration the past? Try to break down these the temporality that's being suggested in the writing. It's present as a field here. So here we see that the author has put this in quotation marks, and it is referring back to the same present that I just made a comment of over here as well. So let's highlight this here, and maybe let's see if there is a connection between the two. It's present as a field of value coding and a sense of value that is logically, not necessarily chronologically, prior to the economic, the political, the economic, the affective, are entangled there. Sense of value that is logically private. So that here you can highlight this as well. It's again in quotation marks, and you can ask, and in this context, it's in field of value coding, sense of value coding, new concept. Try how often has it been used in the text. So there. So I guess this is very, very brief strategies that you can use during your first reading of the text. You definitely need to ask yourself a few questions. You need to identify things you're familiar with. You need to identify things you're not familiar with. And in order to help you through your third reading or through your fourth reading of the piece. And then when you come back to it, give yourself some time. Maybe you need a few days apart from in between your readings in order to, as I said, bring in a fresh perspective and try to digest the material better, maybe in a few days' time from now. Okay, so I will stop sharing my screen. I'm open to any questions you may have. I've just posted my email here as well. Oh, you cannot see it because I just stopped sharing my screen. All right. In case you wanted to discuss the readings further, I can also send you PDF versions of the highlighted as well as the not edited. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me regarding these writings. I hope some of the strategies that I presented today on especially the three-step reading approach, scanning, starting, and studying, being critical. Unfortunately, we won't be able, due to the time of the workshop, we won't be able to arrive to the third stage of being critical. Do definitely spend more time with the reading. Your first reading of it, as I said, should take a maximum 1 hour, 2 hours, or even 3 hours. What we kind of did today was a very basic scan. We skimmed through the paper, we identified keywords and key concepts that we want to further explore. And this is where you would do so in further readings of the same article. So yes, I'm open to any questions you may have, and yeah, feel free to reach out to me anytime. And hopefully, yeah, with something interesting with your own, whether you agree with the artist or maybe you don't. So whatever you have to say about this, I'm always open to hearing your thoughts.
Cool. Thank you, Emil. That was amazing. I do have one question. Might be helpful for students. Is where did you find out about all this stuff? That's the most simple way I could ask this. Like, is there like a good book or a few text sources that would be good, or is it stuff that you've picked up in certain OCAD departments or a department at another school or something? Like, what's a good first step if somebody wants to improve these study habits? Where's a good place to find info?
Like to improve their reading habits, or to just or to get access to the art and theory textbook where you'd be getting access to more readings?
Oh, I guess more
Like
the
more resources?
no, like I was thinking about like how you figured out how to do all this stuff. Like you're very good at like breaking down the text and that kind of stuff. So you seem to have strategies that you like employ no matter what the text is.
Yeah, well, through like experience. Like
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
want like a resource, I can definitely find. I actually unfortunately haven't been in touch with the Writing and Learning Center, but I would suppose that they run related workshops like to students' study skills and success. I haven't heard of any. I have not been attending those, but no, I guess it's just um my own my own doing. Like
Yeah, I assumed it might be experience. Yeah, I just wanted to check if there was like a good place in the school or online or something or in a book. But I think it's a lot of it's to do with trial and error and going
exactly,
doing
exactly.
stuff in
I,
classes and getting feedback.
yeah. Yeah, and I really hope that what I presented was clear, and I
Oh,
hope
it
it
was, yeah.
wasn't confusing.
No, it was perfect. It was
I
clear.
did not prepare for a no engagement like that. Yeah.
No, it was really good considering the curveball you got thrown at the last minute there. But yeah, it was really insightful. I think it's going to be really helpful to a lot of students.
Hopefully.
Um, what I'm going to do though is, oh, did you have something for the workshop?
I do have all my PDFs ready if you wanted to. I don't know. What do you mean for the workshop?
Oh, I was going to pause or stop the recording. So
I